producing nation. But how much do you know about this valuable yet finite resource? On our radio program, Guyana's Oil and You, we strike at the heart of every issue with informed views and credible data. The time is now for you to arm yourself with insightful knowledge on your oil wealth. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's episode of Guyana's Oil and You. I am your hostess, a senior journalist of Kaieteur News, Kiana Wilburg, and tonight we will continue the conversation on local content since there's an ongoing consultation process for the draft policy. Here to share his expertise with us this evening is Mr. Arthur Deakin. He's the co-director of energy at America's Market Intelligence. And for those of you who may not be aware, America's Market Intelligence is the leading provider of market research and competitive intelligence for Latin America across a range of industries. Deakin, who is also a native of Brazil, is here to share with us some critical lessons which we all should pay attention to from Brazil as we move to craft our own local content policy. That said, Arthur, this is your second time on Guyana's Oil and You. Thank you so much for joining us.
Of course, happy to be here again.
Excellent. So let's head right into our discussion this evening. In one of your most recent pieces, sir, you would have applauded Guyana's efforts to have a robust policy on local content. But you also noted that some of the targets that we are proposing in terms of having 100% Guyanese participation might be too high. Could you kindly expound on your reasoning for this?
Yeah, of course. I think that, first of all, the local content policy is a good start. I think that the government is very serious about proposing a policy that works well with the energy sector, and is seriously speaking to several stakeholders, including the oil majors, but also private sector and the public. And that's the right attitude for them to have to get a local content policy that really works for Guyana, because it depends on the country and their expertise, that the local content has to adapt to the reality of that country. So in terms of 100% requirements that are set out in the local content policy, I think that in certain cases, mostly in some of the less skilled labor, the 100% is a requirement, and it should be kept that way. I think that the Guyanese have the capacity to fulfill those jobs, and with 25% unemployment of the labor force, more or less, in the local market in Guyana, I think it's essential to start up with 100% for those certain services. But then again, in the more technical services, geophysics and other upstream jobs that Guyana still doesn't have the capacity or the expertise to provide the services, I think that some of the thresholds are a little bit too high. I think one of them that I pointed out was 90% local content within the 10 years of the license being approved. And of course, ideally, in an ideal world, that 90% would be satisfied by the Guyanese workforce. But with a country with no oil and gas precedents and limited training in terms of these technical skills, I think it's a little bit too optimistic that Guyana will be able to fulfill those targets. Not to say that that Guyanese don't have the capacity to do that. I completely not saying that. I think the local people do have the intelligence and the education to do that. Just they haven't had the training yet, for the most part, to fulfill those roles. So I think that mitigating some of the reducing a little bit of the thresholds for the highly technical services to give the Guyanese people more time to train, I think that would be a little bit more appropriate.
So, would you recommend that some of these targets might be done over a 10 or 15-year period? Because we have several projects that we are looking to bring on board. I believe that the Stabber Block Consortium is looking to bring 10 FPSOs within this decade. So, do you believe that we'll still have some amount of time to perhaps catch up in some of these technical areas?
Yeah, I think that no doubts, over time the local population is going to develop these skills. We're just at the first FPSO right now, and there'll be at least 10. That's the estimates. But Vice President Jagdeo even said that Guyana doesn't have the capacity right now to build one FPSO. So thinking about building several at the same time, in addition to providing several other highly technical services, is just not realistic at this point. Not to say that over time the local population won't develop those skills. I think they will, and I think they should. But I think the thresholds, the requirements for local content are a little bit too high, in my opinion, for those highly technical services.
I want to go a little bit to how targets are pretty much determined. What would was the experience where Brazil was concerned in terms of going about the targets? Because I know that they too perhaps were overly optimistic, to use your phrase, or perhaps they were overly ambitious in terms of the targets that they set for exploration or midstream and downstream. So, how would you say Guyana should go about setting a target that is achievable for the operator or for oil companies?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I like the phrasing overly ambitious more than overly optimistic. I think ambitious is more appropriate for what Guyana is trying to do. I think that with Brazil, we saw that the targets were a little bit too high, and that led to some delays in development of projects. It discouraged some foreign investment, and it wasn't until the local content policy was revised in 2018 where the thresholds were lowered, and some of the fines were excluded, that investment and exploration really took off in the pre-salt area in offshore Brazil. So I think it's finding a balance between having the people employed, which is very important, having the local people participate in the economy, while at the same time not discouraging investment and development of this sector. I think the way you get there is really by talking to several stakeholders, as the government has been doing, looking at what has worked in the past. But it's got to be apples to apples. You can't really compare Guyana to Brazil, because Brazil just has a massive industry, 200 million people. So the chances that they have those technical skills are much likelier just because of the size. So it's got to be realistic. It's got to be comparable to a country, a frontier country of similar size. We can look at some countries in Africa, but even then, Guyana is much smaller than those countries. So I think it's communication with stakeholders, looking at precedents in terms of what worked. And of course, I mean, the local content policy can be drafted now with certain targets and then revalued down the road in 5 years to adjust to the reality. So, I think that's always a possibility as well.
Absolutely. But I'd like to just throw something at you. What are your thoughts on the importance of a gap analysis? Because during some of my research, I would have found that many countries sort of missed this sort of fundamental step in ascertaining what the country has at this point in time and what it has the capability of developing over a period, and using that information to inform realistic targets. What is your experience in the field where this is concerned?
Yeah, I think a gap analysis is essential, just to align between the reality on the ground, and then the expectations of the people developing the policy. And I think that in the case of this draft, there was a little bit of a overly ambitious mindset to get these thresholds very high, and perhaps it was a technique by the government to start really high and then negotiate to more of a middle ground, like any kind of bargaining technique. But at the same time, it's pretty telling when you see in the local content policy that a certain percentage of steel plates and steel equipment has to be provided by the local Guyana steel. And Guyana doesn't manufacture steel, so the fact that that clause was there is a little bit concerning in a way, or it's not very realistic. So I think gap analysis is essential to really align reality with expectations.
Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to just hone in a little bit on some of the lessons that you would have pointed out in your most recent column, where Brazil, the sixth largest country in the world, is concerned. What are some of the key mistakes that Brazil made? I know that you mentioned the fact that the targets when they first started out was just too high, but I wanted to take it a bit to the former legislation that you would have spoken to in your column, where you said that there were 90 different categories of services, but Guyana now has over 100, I think, in its draft policy. If you can shed some light on that.
Yeah, just going off of what you initially said, the targets were a little bit too high in terms of the local content requirements. There were some disproportionate fines for non-compliance, and then just general bottlenecks that hurt the construction of FPSOs in Brazil. So as we've seen in other countries, if the local content requirements are too strict or too onerous from the start, and not aligned with the local industry, the development of projects tend to be delayed, and sometimes even foreign investors may be hesitant to enter the country. But regarding the different categories of services and equipment in the Brazilian former local content law, which is not the current local content law anymore, we saw that there was over 90 different categories of services and equipment, and within those there were several requirements. And all of those also had to be certified via accredited agencies. So it was just a massive bureaucracy, and it was used in Brazil. The bureaucracy is to the advantage of the government, because it facilitates corruption, facilitates bribery. If something is not moving along, it forces people to look at other options to get things moving, and those options are usually breaking the law, which is not right. So that's something that we want to avoid in Guyana, and Brazil also did all of that because they really wanted to protect the local competition. Brazil has always been a country that's very closed to outside imports. They've always had very high tariffs to try and protect their local economy, and that's been very hurtful in terms of growth. So the fact that Guyana has, from my count, over 111 different categories of services, and all of them with different requirements, that's a little bit concerning. If there's a way to simplify the law without jeopardizing the content and what it's trying to achieve, I think that would be very positive.
Do you think leaving 111 different categories would make it problematic from a regulatory perspective?
Considering that Guyana has had a history where it struggles to enforce certain policies and certain laws, I would say yes. I think that there is a possibility of unifying certain categories, and making it more standard. That will not only help with supervision and accountability in terms of the regulator enforcing that the companies are following through, but it'll also make it easier for the oil companies to follow through and implement these requirements without getting tripped up. So it's kind of a win-win in that sense.
Okay, thank you very much for that. The other aspect that I'd like to move to now, since I mentioned regulation, it has to do with accountability and keeping political interference at bay. And I know that this is something that you are quite passionate about because I've seen it as a theme in many of your pieces. Now, the proposed hierarchy that I'm seeing in the draft policy is that you're going to have the Petroleum Commission whenever it comes on stream. That body would be responsible for implementing the local content policy, but it would be only be able to do this through a local content secretariat. Now, that secretariat is going to be controlled or supervised by an interagency coordinating committee that will be made up of senior officials of various government ministries. I want to know if this type of arrangement concerns you to any degree, given your experience in the sector, and do you believe that it could possibly breed opportunities for political coercion?
In short, yes. The intergovernmental committee to supervise the local secretariat in conjunction with the Petroleum Commission, it's a positive sign to have several different checks and balances.
Yes.
We've seen that work in several different countries, but it seems from what I've heard and from what I've read that it's still very connected to the political party in control. So you can have all these different, bodies of accountability, but if they're all filled with friends of the president, then it's kind of is not very effective. So we've seen that in Malaysia with the 1MDB scandal. They had a intergovernmental agency committee to look over that fund, and it was just filled with the prime minister's cronies. So it's really important, in my opinion, to have a completely independent body such as the World Bank, the UN, whomever it may be, that has no connections to the political parties, to supervise all of this. I think that's very important.
Okay. And apart from many of the things that you would have mentioned in your writings, are there any separate fundamental elements that, in your view, we should ensure that we get right in this policy, apart from the importance of definitions and ensuring that the regulatory process is free from any political interference? Are there any other key tips that you would advise Guyana to get right in this process of crafting its policy?
Yes, I think that the local content policy should, as I mentioned earlier, definitely keep the high thresholds for some of the services jobs that are not as technical. I think that's very important, and it will be a big boost in terms of employment for the country. That said, I think the local content policy needs to focus more on the midstream and the downstream sectors instead of the upstream, which is very technical. The upstream sector is usually very, very hard to have people capable of dealing with all the requirements of the upstream development. So just to put it in perspective, the Liza Phase 1 development alone cost $5 billion, and Guyana's GDP in 2019 wasn't even that. So it's just got to be realistic in that sense. I think that also, you got to find the right balance between requiring Guyanese companies with the subsidiaries of foreign companies having a certain amount of Guyanese employees in those subsidiaries. I think that's important because you don't want foreign subsidiaries to just set office in Guyana and count as local content. I know that the policy has specific definitions of that and requires at least 51% of the subsidiaries to be Guyanese, owned by Guyanese citizens. So that's an important part. And all in all, I think more important than anything, it's realistic targets, constant communication, and learning from precedents from other countries that have had a successful local content policy.
Thank you very much. And my final question. I noticed that several countries, they do go the route of implementing penalties for non-compliance. Uh, Given your work, do you believe that this is the most effective route for non-compliance?
I think that accountability is important, and fines, if they are reasonable and justifiable in terms of not fulfilling a realistic local content requirement, I think those are fine. The problem is when the local content requirement is unrealistic and the fines are disproportionate. I think that's when the validity and the legitimacy of the local content loses some ground and kind of forces people not to comply. And it's just a big mess because the companies that get fined don't agree with it and they won't pay for it. So it's just finding the right balance in terms of what's really realistic and fair.
Okay. Mr. Deacon, thank you very much for joining us once again. This was definitely enlightening. I do know that our listeners, wherever they are, they would have found this program enlightening to many extents. So thank you very much. And we do hope that we can have you back again to talk about local content and many other important issues to the Guyanese people and on the industry as a whole. Thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in to Guyana's Oil and You, and do have a good evening.
Thank you.